We're all watching the biggest race in the world at the moment, the US presidential election, about a month to go. I know that you're close with the Trump camp. I mean, what are your observations here?
Well, I think this race is vitally important. I fear another 4 years of the Democrats in the White House. I think Kamala Harris is continuity Joe Biden. And what we have seen is we have seen appeasement and capitulation to our enemies. You know, whether it's China, whether it's Russia, or whether it's Iran. You know, why is Iran able to sponsor terrorist organisations? Biden took the sanctions off Iran on the basis they would strike a deal on nuclear proliferation. In fact, Iran is almost at the point of getting a nuclear weapon. And at every single juncture, America has projected weakness. I mean, I was involved at the tail end of the Afghanistan withdrawal. They failed to work with their allies. They signalled to Putin that they weren't prepared to stand up to aggression. And the domestic policies in the US have also been very bad for people, reversing the tax cuts, stopping new oil and gas. I mean, it's still a better situation than Britain. You know, in Britain, we have the highest energy prices in the developed world. It is killing our economy. The last steelworks in Britain, the last blast furnace has just closed down.
Oil refinery is
closed down. But what I'm seeing in America is the same things that started happening in Britain 5 or 10 years ago are now happening in the US. And I worry that the strongest economy in the world, the most powerful free democracy, is currently under leadership that doesn't value Western civilization and is not just appeasing the likes of Iran and Russia, but also appealing the Islamist separatists in America, appeasing the transgender activists, appeasing the climate extremists who just want to shut everything down. And I think 4 years of that is going to be an absolute disaster. Conversely, if Trump gets in, I think it'll have a very positive effect on countries like the UK and Australia if we see the US motoring ahead.
Tony?
Look, I often used to say that politics wasn't a choice between good and great or even between good and bad. Sometimes it was a choice between bad and worse. People would often look at me and say, yeah, we get that. But the leader of the free world, because that's what the US president is, has got to be capable of standing up to the enemies of the free world. And whatever faults Donald Trump might have, whatever mistakes Donald Trump might have made, we know from his previous time as president that he was capable of standing up to the West's enemies. I think we are in the middle of a civilisational struggle. I think too many of us are oblivious to it. But in a civilisational struggle, you've got to know whose side you're on. And this can't be a managerial exercise. This isn't a split the difference business. It's a business where you win or you lose. And we have got to make sure that our countries and our values emerge strong and victorious.
And we were talking earlier about the problems of the bureaucracy in Britain. I see those same problems in the United States. I've worked with the State Department. I know there are deeply embedded attitudes that are not, pursuing the right policies with regard to China, Russia and Iran. And I think you do need a character like Donald Trump, controversial though he is, to actually take on those forces. Because there are lots of good, rational politicians, but what we're dealing with is not the old left-right battle. It's not a bit of tax here, a bit of spend here. It's people who literally want to destroy our countries, are embedded in our governments, and they need to be taken on. And that's why I do think President Trump has the ability the fearlessness to take them on.
You make a good point, Liz. I mean, in the old days, the Marxists just wanted to destroy the economy. Now they want to destroy society. And they've been more effective, let's face it, in persuading the middle class to revolt against the patriarchy and to crusade for saving the economy, even if it does, saving the planet, even if it does mean destroying the economy, than they ever were at persuading the working class to go for equality.
I'll come back to that, but I want to just touch on China before we leave this geopolitical chat, because as troubling as the Middle East is, as troubling as Russia in its invasion of Ukraine is, the real global player here is China. It took Britain a long time to wake up to China. I think your eyes are open, and I put it down to perhaps geography.
I think it took all of us a long time to wake up.
It's true, but I think there was a whole discussion, remember, about whether you would put Huawei into your network.
I don't think Britain has fully... We haven't done enough on China. There's still far too much influence in British universities. We have huge numbers of overseas students. We've recently had the Labour government in Britain reversing a law on free speech, allegedly due to pressure from the Chinese authorities, because the universities wanted the money from overseas students. There's a lot of pressure. I saw this when I was in government, from the Treasury, to not close down routes from investment from China, to do more trade with China, because they saw it as boosting the economy in the short term. And I think there needs to be much more coordination from Western powers to take on China economically, as well as make sure we're properly prepared in defence terms. And at present, what I see is every European country, the EU, they're all going to China on business missions, trying to get more investment. They still haven't really understood the threat China poses. And China is now working with Iran and Russia. These are not separate conflicts going on in different parts of the world. China are breaking the sanctions. They are helping make sure that Russia has the supply of weapons they need against Ukraine. And we need to view it as an overall challenge of the authoritarian axis. And the West needs to work much more closely together than it is at the moment.
And of course, at the time of all of this for Australia, we've never been as degraded militarily as we are now.
We've made ourselves too dependent on friends who we can't always rely on, and we've made ourselves too vulnerable to antagonists who we know want to change the world for the worse. And whether it's Britain not being able to itself authorise the Ukrainians to use Storm Shadows because they're dependent upon Americans for the targeting, that's a problem. Or whether it's Australia still having Chinese componentry in our vital supply chains and so on. Whatever it is, there's got to be more self-reliance. Now, this is not an anti-market position. I am pro the market, but the market is not the only thing. And if you are going to be a sovereign, independent country, there are some things that you've got to be able to do yourself.
And it's not really a market when China is using state subsidies to undermine companies overseas, and they're using it for industrial espionage. It is not a genuine market, and they have been able to just flout World Trade Organization rules for years and years and years and get away with it.
Let's just talk about the health of the centre-right and the health of political parties going forward. I mean, we can all talk about how critical a strong centre-right is to the West, but what happened with young people and attracting them to look at the centre-right as the government of the future? One of the challenges you have is to modernise the party to be attractive to young people but keeping hold of its values. And the left have ownership of all the language, the pejoratives of language are on the centre-right.
It hasn't always been that way, Peter. I mean,
so how do you speak to modern conservatives now, Tony?
If you go back to the times of successful centre-right governments, the Thatchers, the Reagans, the Howards, we got a very strong youth vote, or a comparatively strong youth vote, because there was the pride in the country, which I think most people instinctively have and want to show. But if we are diffident and apologetic, well then it's very hard to inspire. You will only inspire people if they think you are serious and you believe this and it matters to you and you are prepared to fight for it.
Liz?
If you look at Britain, in fact, I think in the 18 to 24-year-olds, Reform are doing as well as Labour, particularly amongst young men. So there is evidence that young men in particular are frustrated about the situation of Britain and are voting for a party or advocating for a party on the right. The problem is that because Conservatives haven't been standing up for our beliefs, because we've essentially become technocrats, almost justifying the decisions made by the civil service, that's just not exciting for people. That's not something you get on board with. And young people have been turned off. And I think if you look at Canada and what Pierre Poilievre is doing, again, he is inspiring young people with true Conservative messages. So I don't believe the left only young. They don't. And actually, now we've got a left-wing government in Britain, people are realising how useless Labour is. I mean, part of the problem was every single issue, whether it was COVID or whether it was the war in Ukraine or the price of heating, everything could be blamed on the Conservatives. Now, the Labour government own the problem. So I do think there is an opportunity for the right, but we have to be exciting, forward-looking, visionary, and not just justifying ourselves, which is what we were doing.
What next for you?
Well, I've got my book out, 10 Years to Save the West. I'm doing a launch tomorrow with Tony here in Sydney. I'm very excited about that. But I care passionately about the future of Western civilization. I do think it is under threat. So I'm looking for any way that I can help make the case. And having spent 10 years as a government minister in Britain, I do understand what is wrong with the system and we need to change it. And unless we're prepared to do that, I don't think we'll be able to affect that change. So one of the things I want to do is explain to people why things aren't working at the moment and what we need to do to change it.
A lot of people say, Tony Abbott, that it feels like the 1930s, the late 1930s at the moment, and that's not just in a security sense, but right across the board. You look around the world, and I don't know where our Churchills are. How concerned are you about the climate we are in now, the threat of China, Xi's clear statements of intent? Are we awake to the threat that's real?
Well, the phrase that's been used by me amongst others is that we are sleepwalking through Lotus Land. I do think this is a civilisational moment. I do think that we are challenged externally and internally in a way never before. But I also think that any fair-minded judge would say that thanks to the long ascendancy of the West, the Pax Britannica succeeded by the Pax Americana, at least in 2020, the world was more safe, more fair, more free, more rich for more people than at any time in human history. So there is so much to be proud of, and we've got to build on our strengths rather than just disintegrate in decadence, which seems to be happening at the moment.
All right, just before we go, I'm going to ask you, getting to the apex of politics in your country, and this is a question to both of you. As you left, is there something you wish you knew or better understood before you walked in that door at Downing Street, that famous black door the first time, before you walked into the office? I can't say the lodge because you never lived in the lodge. Is there something that the idea of writing a letter back to your 16-year-old self and things that you might have wished you would know, was there anything that struck you as you took on the biggest job in Britain?
I mean, I learned a hell of a lot during that short period, and I'd spent 10 years as a government minister. I'd had all the battles, fighting the bureaucracy, fighting the people that didn't want change, fighting the left. And I thought that when I got to the top, I would have the power to make the decisions that needed to be done. And what I discovered was a lot of those powers were illusory, that they were held elsewhere. So the big learning for me was about how much power has been taken away from the Prime Minister as part of Parliament in Britain. But I don't think you have to be there to learn that. I don't think it's something somebody could have told me in advance.
Yeah.
It was experiencing the way it worked that made me understand why it was that my predecessors hadn't done the things that they said they would do when they went into office. So I think one thing I had was a lot more sympathy for my predecessors not delivering on their promises when I understood just how difficult it had become to get things done.
Tony Abbott?
Look, Liz is absolutely right. One of the things that I discovered was just how constrained you were. I made assumptions about the Senate, which turned out not to be true. I made assumptions about the Liberal-run states, which turned out not to be true.
You mean believing you had a mandate and that they would honour the mandate?
So there's got to be a personnel plan as well as a policy plan these days. But look, it was an incredible honour to lead a party. It was an incredible honour to lead a country, and I savour every second of it. And I guess the one thing you do is, I suppose, look back with pride, and I dare say some regret, because there was always more that could be done.
Thank you both for your time.